G'day again everyone, and welcome to the fourth and final video in week 3 of our admin law course. This video finishes off our discussion of the ancient prerogative writs of certiorari, mandamus, prohibition, habeas corpus and quo warranto by tying off a few loose ends so that we'll be ready to get out of the time machine and start looking at administrative law in the more modern world. You'll be pleased to know this is the shortest of the 4 videos this week. The first thing I want to do is observe the fact that the writs we've been talking about are all common law writs. So they came out of the system of common law. But most of you will already know that over the centuries there was a parallel body of law developing in England, and we call that system the law of equity. Now, I'm not going to go through what equity law is and how it developed, or this would turn into an equity video instead of an admin law one. If you don't remember, now's a good time to pause this video and go brush up very quickly and then come back. One of the features of equity was that it developed a range of more flexible remedies than the common law. If a plaintiff sued in the common law for, say, breach of contract, usually the only remedy available to them would be damages. Equity developed a range of other remedies. 2 of them, injunction and declaration, are important to us here, because they're very similar to some of the remedies arising from the common law writs. Injunction, for instance, is an order by the court to either do something or refrain from doing something. In other words, the equitable remedy of injunction does virtually the same thing as mandamus and prohibition. So, in Coward and Allen, a series of search warrants were executed on premises relevant to Mr. Coward. Relevant to allegations about money laundering activities and unlawful financial transactions. Mr. Coward held the view that the warrants were invalid. He challenged the validity of the search warrants and asked for an injunction against the execution of the warrants and an injunction against any reliance by police on things found under the warrants. The High Court ultimately found that the warrants were valid. But there was no doubt that if the court had agreed with Mr. Coward, the execution of the warrants would have been prevented by an injunction. Declaration is a little bit different. Under the remedy of declaration, the court authoritatively declares the rights and responsibilities of the parties before the court. So, for instance, a court might declare that a certain decision was made improperly. This looks a lot like the actions taken by the courts under the early writs of certiorari, where a decision was brought before a higher court for inspection. A good example came in the Church of Scientology against Woodward, a High Court case. Now, the Church of Scientology, I think it's fair to say, is a controversial organisation. It's been accused of being a cult, among other things. Personally, I don't pretend to know anything much about Scientology. However, the Scientologists believed that because they were controversial, ASIO and other government agencies were conducting unlawful surveillance and spying on them, and they wanted them to stop. So they applied to the High Court for a series of declarations. Those declarations, if they'd been made, would have made it clear that in the opinion of the High Court, those activities should stop. Now, the Scientologists ultimately lost their application for some fairly technical reasons, but the court made it very clear that it did have the power to make those declarations. And even if they lost, the Scientologists were able to bring the government before a court and express their concerns. The real advantage of these remedies, and in particular declaration, is how flexible they are. There are a lot of detailed rules about certiorari, mandamus, prohibition, even habeas corpus. There are perhaps even more rules when it comes to injunctions. However, the court can make pretty much any declaration that seems appropriate. The declaration on its own doesn't change anything. But the government, faced with a declaration by the court that it has done the wrong thing, will inevitably take steps to fix the problem. It's just impossible to imagine the executive government taking the position that even though the court says they've done the wrong thing, they're just going to keep on doing it. Now, almost all of the of the remedies or causes of action which I've talked about in this video was specifically written into the Australian Constitution when it took effect in 1901. Section 75 of the Constitution says that in all matters in which a writ of mandamus or prohibition or an injunction is sought against an officer of the Commonwealth, the High Court shall have original jurisdiction. This means that not even the Parliament can remove the capacity of the High Court to hear a case where one of those three causes of action are in place. Elsewhere in the same section, the High Court has original jurisdiction in any case in which the Commonwealth or a person suing or being sued on behalf of the Commonwealth is a party. This effectively gives the court the power of declaration. So you can see that provision in the Constitution brought the old common law English writs and gave them constitutional authority in Australia. As a result, strictly speaking, they're known in Australia as constitutional writs. They still exist and they can still be sued. As we're going to see in future modules, though, they're very rarely sued nowadays because our system of administrative law has advanced and there are now better ways to achieve the same things. Okay, so here we are at the end of week 3. This week we've looked back into history to find out how, over the centuries, central governments have controlled local decision makers and how that process gradually morphed into a process whereby individual citizens could challenge government decisions. We've learned about certiorari, whereby a court can call a decision before it and review that decision. We've learned about mandamus and prohibition, which are two sides of the same coin. A writ of mandamus says to a public servant, you must go and do your duty, whereas a writ of prohibition says, stop what you're doing. We've learned about the writ of habeas corpus, under which a person who is in detention can demand to be brought before the court so they can challenge their detention. We've learned about the equitable remedies of injunction, which covers much of the same ground as mandamus and prohibition, and the equitable remedy of declaration, by which the court can declare that a decision is unlawful for some reason. And we've seen how those powers were ultimately written into the Australian Constitution. Over the centuries, you can see the slow development of administrative law. But the development was slow, and it was even slower in England, perhaps because the class system of England made people less likely to challenge their rulers than the relatively egalitarian Australians. Along the way, though, the courts developed rules for decision makers to follow. You see, when they issued, say, a writ of prohibition, the courts would indicate what was wrong with the decision. And as a result, decision makers knew to avoid that error in the future. The more that this happened, the more the common law evolved a set of principles for proper decision making. Next week's going to be the final week where we deal with some of these basic underlying concepts. We're going to look at the distinction between merits review and legal review. We're going to look at the distinction between broad and narrow ultra vires, and we're going to take a quick look at the grounds for review under the Administrative Decisions Judicial Review Act 1977. See you next week.